The new pack is here, and we are going to be discussing what's top tier. Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode, and with the release of the newest selection pack, I was right, Ryzeal is here, Ext is at 2, we got 6 Sam, we got Meowls, we got a Bow, a Q, etc. Which is a pretty impactful pack, regardless of the rest of the cards in the pack. Well, as long as we get Ryzeal at more or less full power. I don't think we necessarily need Star, but it'd be nice if we got it. We're going to be discussing what are the best decks with which to climb in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. I will also be doing a tier list later for Worlds format, and what I expect to be the most represented, as well as the best performing decks in a Worlds style format later. But for right now, these are the best decks with which to climb in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. So, we're just going to hop right into this. And I believe this is pretty much everything. I might be missing a few things here or there, but I do believe this is mostly everything. So yeah, we're just going to quickly hop into this. Starting off with Tenpai. Tenpai is still a top tier deck in the current metagame and in the next one as well, because Tenpai kind of plays by its own rules. First of all, in a best of one, it's absolutely goated, due to the fact that it actually allows you to kind of ignore what the opponent is doing. As long as you have the non-engine, you have the ability to play against pretty much anything. And if you just high roll enough, which is not necessarily difficult for this deck to do, you can just win. It's exceptional in a best of one style format. It's going to stay in tier 2. Next up we have Fire King. Fire King is a decent option. Fire King Snake Eye is still fairly good, and for the most part is still comparable. Not really anything to write home about, but still good. Same thing with Yubel. Yubel is still fairly decent. A Power Q does boost the deck overall, but it's not really anything to write home about as well. I still think it is a top tier option, and it's definitely something you can play and will do / perform fairly well, but overall, not really anything to specifically write home about. Rescue Ace is another fairly okay option. It has options for going first, for going second. It has the ability to play a bunch of non-engine, but it also does kind of require you to not brick, which is not exactly a good idea. It's not terrible, but it's not great. Tier Lament. Tier Lament is honestly still fairly top tier as well, due to the fact that the Tier Lament cards work similarly to that of Tenpai, but more as a going first style deck, which makes them a little bit weaker because they're not as kind of anti-meta, for lack of a better term. But overall, they are still very powerful. They still have a lot of oomph, and they can push through pretty much anything, just due to the fact that graveyard effects are so very powerful. Pearly's not really doing anything of note. I don't think it's bad, but I don't think it's great. So yeah, there's that. Branded is okay. I really don't see it doing all that well. It's decent. It's not terrible. It's fairly consistent, but it's not really anything to write home about. The added consistency that Branded Fusion to 2 gave them didn't really change much, because in comparison to that of Malice or Ryzeal or Tenpai or the myriad of other decks above them, even Tier Lament, I would say, which does a similar thing, it's just not quite as powerful. So I would say that Tier Lament overall is arguably better, and therefore I think Branded is going to be slightly below them. Also, I'll put Branded above the above Rescue Ace. Mathmech. Mathmech, there's not really a reason to play Mathmech in particular, because Malice exists, and Mathmech doesn't really do well into the same cards that, hit Malice, which isn't great. But it's okay. Yeah, we'll put it in everything else. There's just not really a reason. It dies to, everything, so I say it dies to everything. It dies to Meowls, it dies to Fualos, it dies to Perulia. Well, not dies to, but it's not great into Perulia. It's not great into Maxi. It's not great into Nib. It's decent into Lancia and Droll, which is okay, right? But it also doesn't trade very well into big board breakers. So give or take. Most of the time you're just gonna see it paired with Malice anyway. Dragon Link, not great. Not really worth noting. Voiceless Voice. I've actually seen Voiceless Voice doing fairly well, but the thing is, it's just a fairly solid going first deck. You just kind of hope and pray that you go first. If you go first, you can just kind of immediately win the game. Going second, you might be able to draw a Maxi or some sort of combination of hand traps Impulse or something like that. Not Impulse. Purge. Purge is the one, I think. you know, to like stifle the opponent's plays or something along those lines. But for the most part, it's not exceptional. Centurion is similar in nature, where I don't think it really gets anything from this pack, so not really anything of note, but it works very similarly to that of Voices. Ritual Beast dies to... This is a deck that dies to everything, if you want to know that. Labyrinth. Labyrinth is a little bit better than what it previously was. Against Malice, it was just so laughably beatable. But against Ryzeal, it does have a little bit more play. But right now, it's not really all that great. So I don't really think it's really going to keep up. The problem is that Detonator just kind of cooks Lab. So you kind of have to hope that they don't get to Detonator. But being able to like book things with Daruma Cannon or something else of that nature is fairly nice. And like Calm Pulse and Dimensional Barrier style effects are fairly decent against Ryzeal. Rika is not consistent enough and doesn't necessarily have the oomph to push through some very powerful end boards right now. So not really worth it. Kashtira is not good. It's a simple deck. It's a stun deck, but it's not actually all that good, all things considered. Sprite is fairly okay. It's not exceptional, but notably it still has access to things like Elf and what have you, which means that as like an engine and the ability to kind of set up a very powerful end board, it's not terrible. It's just like a weaker version of Malice or Ryzeal. That's all. But like it still does the same things, and it's still fairly powerful, all things considered. Stun is honestly not great. The thing is, stun, when there's one top deck, when there's one deck you have to consider, and it's a combo deck, it's great. When there's two top decks, and when there's two top decks, one of which is not specifically a hard combo deck, but is instead more of a mid-range style deck, especially with something like Detonator, yeah, it's just not going to do nearly as well. It's still stun, it still just gets to win games because of its anti-meta nature, but it's not exceptional. Chimera is worse branded, which is worse tier, therefore not really worth it. I wouldn't say it's a great option for climbing, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Melodious loses a lot of its power plays in regards to like having a fairly decent matchup against Malice and stuff like that, and being able to play like Lancia and Herald and all of that jazz and what have you. That just doesn't matter against Ryzeal. Not nearly as much. So, it's not terrible, but it's also not great. So, there you go. Next up, we have Salad. Salad is kind of dead. It's just worse Math Mech at this point. Like, it's just every Cyber deck, except worse. Cool. Moving along. White Forest, I think, is a fairly decent option. You could also play it with Tier, which gives it a nice oomph as well, with like a very significant end board and, you know, some very high power spells and stuff like that, which makes it fairly decent. And overall, like, the end board is insanely powerful. It's one of the best going first decks. Its problem is dying to Droll, but with Droll dying down against, like, you know, Ryzeal or against Malice or something like that, which don't really die to Droll, because obviously we're not playing Mitsurugi. Yeah, this deck is probably a little bit better just due to maybe people playing less Droll or what have you. So, there's that. It really does depend on Droll. I think Droll will be lower in priority, which means that this deck kind of gets a bump there. Also, I think Nib will probably drop in priority as well, because it doesn't pair very well against, like, Ryzeal, when they can just, like, Detonator pass if they really want to. Gimmick Puppet. Gimmick Puppet is a gimmick, but it's not really all that good. It's similar in nature to Stun. It might have a good win rate, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It's probably just a few players happening to play it. If it ever were to become even remotely more popular, and people, like, play more imperms and stuff like that, it all of a sudden just, like, falls apart. So, there's that. I really don't think it's great for climbing as well, because it is almost exclusively reliant on the like, coin flip. So, not great. Dino dies to itself most of the time. Snake Eye. Snake Eye is actually extremely strong. We actually tested this not too long ago. Post-Banless, post-Malice. It still did extremely well. It's currently a really high win rate. I think it's higher win rate than Malice, even. And a lot of that is due to the fact that, one, it doesn't die to the Malice cards, which is something. Now, I don't think it's necessarily better for climbing, but two, the other thing is that it actually is just a good deck still. It's still comparable in nature to what it previously was. The Oak Ban was okay, like it kind of mattered, but it really didn't. So for the most part, like the limitations to the deck were mostly just to make way for Malice and Ryzeal. And honestly, it did, right? Malice is the best deck. Snake Eye, I would say, is up there. I don't know if it's the second currently best deck, but it's somewhere up there. So there's that. Hero is not great. We're just going to move along. Millennium is also not really worth talking about outside of the actual Millennium engine, which is used in a bunch of different decks. But overall, the Millennium cards as well are also gonna get significantly worse due to Detonator. Detonator just like cooks those cards, which makes them significantly worse for like OTKs and stuff like that. But if you have a way to either slow down the Detonator or prevent the Detonator from realistically hitting the field, or like impermanent or something along those lines, there is a fairly decent shot to still play through with Millennium cards, but that relies on a little bit more power just in your hand or what have you. Fiendsmith. Fiendsmith Control is what I'm going to refer to Fiendsmith as, because there's a bunch of variants of Fiendsmith decks. Fiendsmith Tyr, Fiendsmith Ubel, Fiendsmith with Snake Eye, etc. There's a bunch of different variants of Fiendsmith, but this is Fiendsmith Control, and Fiendsmith Control is still fairly decent. It's not as good because, like, the Bestials aren't nearly as good, because, like, they're okay against Malice, they're not terrible against Malice, but they're not great against Ryzeal. There's not really a whole lot of cards to hit against Ryzeal. There's a few, but not a lot, and for the most part, they can kind of just ignore your Bestials, which makes it not great. But that being said, it's still a fairly strong control deck, and I would probably put it up in the tier 2. I'm putting it above Snake Eye, because the Millennium cards get worse in Snake Eye. So I'm putting it above it, but overall, it's okay. It's not great for climbing, though. All things considered, maybe I should put this lower, because it's actually kind of bad for climbing. Well, it is a strong deck. It's not great for climbing. I'm going to actually put it at the bottom of tier 2. Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is exceptional. Blue Eyes is going to go at the top of tier 2. It's just a solid deck in the TCG as well. It was kind of the third best deck alongside Malice and Ryzeal, and it kind of still sticks there in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel as well. Notably, it doesn't really lose to anything below it. It kind of can, like it can lose to pretty much anything, but it also doesn't really have a terrible matchup into anything else below it. It has a kind of bad matchup into Ryzeal. It has a kind of bad matchup into Malice, where it's like a 60-40 as opposed to like a, 80-20 or something like that. So for the most part, I think that it is fairly well positioned. Memento, I think, is also extremely well positioned. I'm going to put it maybe above Fiendsmith Control. And here's why. I think a lot more people are realistically going to be playing more Molch armies. And Molch armies, specifically that are not named Perulia, that are not named Meowls, are not actually all that great against this deck. So if more Molch armies in general hit the, end up showing up, that's actually kind of better for Memento, because they can play through pretty much any of those with 1 to 2 draws given to the opponent while still doing more or less the full combo, which is pretty solid. Obviously, Max C is still Max C, and you still have to deal with that, but beside that, if it's just more Molch armies and less actual hand traps like Nibiru or Droll or something else of that nature, you're probably pretty fine. And even with that being said, you could also play through Droll and Nibiru and all of that jazz. And on top of that, it doesn't have a bad matchup into either Ryzeal or Malice, which is nice. It's not an exceptional matchup, but it's not a bad matchup. Next up, Sharks. Don't really have anything to say about them. I don't think that they're great for climbing. They're just like worse Ryzeal at this point, so not great. Adamancipator is also not great. It is worse Malice. That's it. Mermail. Mermail is actually fairly decent as well. I'm going to put it, yeah, we're going to put it there. The problem with Mermail is losing the coin flip and bricking, which is not inconsistent or not unlikely for this deck, right? If you end up going second, it's a lot worse for this deck. There's not a whole lot that you can do against, like, fully set up Ryzeal or fully set up Malice, which means that you either have to play, like, hand traps and hope that you see the correct ones, or you have to play, like, you have to just hope that you draw the correct engine to be able to beat, like, the Ryzeal end board and stuff like that, which is fairly possible. I'm not saying it's not, but, like, it's not a particularly decent, or, like, a particularly good matchup for you. It's not like it's a winning matchup for either of those decks. So there's that. Yeah, mostly it's just kind of, like, losing to things that are outside of your control rather than anything that's really in your control. I think Mermail, if it gets to play the game, can beat any deck realistically, even going second. The problem is, like, bricking and not going first and stuff like that. Or, like, getting a maxi dropped on you or something there, you know. That can be very problematic. Next up, Crystron. Crystron I actually don't think is as dead as I previously thought. The problem is, Malice was very bad for Crystron, because if everyone's playing Lancia, that is just like a death sentence to Crystron as well, and a bunch of other things like that just make it more problematic. However, with Ryzeal being added in and more people pivoting to playing Ryzeal as well as pivoting to beating Ryzeal, Crystron gets a little bit better. I don't think it's better than anything else. Yeah, it's probably there. It's kind of like a nice, solid mid-range deck. It still has these solid combos, but it can also end on very minimalistic boards, which plays well into things like Maxi or Fualos or even, like, Meowls. Like, you don't actually summon all that much from the Grave or Banish zone. There's a few times you can, but for the most part, a lot of it is summoning from, like, deck or from extra deck or from hand. You summon from a bunch of different zones, so if they only drop, like, one Molcharmy on you, you're probably pretty fine, which is fairly decent. Next up, Punk. Punk's okay. It has, again, a very strong end board, but again, it does die to a lot of just singleton hand traps. If you're like Xiamen gets impermed, if your Foxy Tune gets ashed, if you end up getting like Ghost Belled on your special summon, or if you get impermed on the magic or on the Rising Carp or something like that, right? Pretty much anything on Rising Carp, to be fair, can kind of just kill you, right? Now you compare it with a secondary engine. I've seen a bunch of different ones, right? Like Terror Top and what have you. But for the most part, like, the Punk cards aren't really doing anything too special. They're similar in nature to, like, White Forest, where it's this big combo deck with a fairly strong end board, but it's still a beatable end board, especially with, like, Tenpai. You just droplet their entire board, and then it's just, well, that's the game, you know? So, yeah, there's that. Malice. We're gonna talk about Malice, and you know what? Actually, let's just talk about Malice and Ryzeal right now. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, seeing how I've talked about the entire rest of the tier list. Malice and Ryzeal are top tier. They are the sole tier 1s right now. I don't think anything realistically would compete with them, period. Malice is second fiddle to Ryzeal for 2 reasons. 1, Malice has heavier silver bullets. Maxi, Meowls, kind of Fualos, but less Fualos. More specifically, Lancia. Even Nib is, like, significantly stronger against Malice than it is against Ryzeal. Granted, you can play through a lot of those, but there are significant weaknesses that Malice has that Ryzeal doesn't. Ryzeal can play through Maxi fairly effectively because Detonator Pass is very strong, and if you go, like, a normal summon Ice, you give them, like, 2 draws with a Detonator. It's not terrible, right? On top of that, if you start with something like an X, you might even be able to have, like, a 3-mat Detonator, or, you know, you might be able to get into, like, an additional, like, Z with, like, an additional draw for them. So, there's a lot that you can do with that post, like, Maxi. It doesn't die to Fualos, it doesn't die to it kind of loses to Perulia. Perulia is a bit of an issue for Ryzeal, but it's not really a silver bullet, it's just kind of like a weakness. Whereas for Malice, it feels like a lot of these cards are just like death sentences. That being said, they're both still incredibly powerful. They're both still able to put up some of the craziest end boards, and more specifically, have the ability to back it up with non-engine, which is what makes them so powerful, because if they're playing against other decks, they're probably going to have a whole bunch of options available to them to just slow you down or stop you from playing the game, and then play the game themselves off of really powerful one-card combos. So, there you go. Sword Soul's just not it. I don't know what else to say. The new support kind of helps, but only if you squint. It doesn't really do anything. Draco Slayer is Pendulum and not very good. Lightsworn is basically a gimmick deck similar to that of Gimmick Puppet, where it is an FTK style strategy with Tier Limit and what have you, and banishing a whole bunch of cards. It's not all that great, all things considered, because it is a fairly lengthy combo that requires a fairly in-depth setup that doesn't really work consistently. Infernoble, also not exactly all that good right now. I mean, I love the deck, but it's not great. Let's just move on. Goblin Bikers are a little bit better, but still not great. In theory, they have a decent matchup against Ryzeal. In practice, it's only okay due to the fact that Ryzeal could also play something like Fiendsmith and then end up not caring. They could also do a myriad of other things as well outside of just the Xyz. They could also just put out a shit ton of Xyz and, like, detonator you to death, or what have you. Or more specifically, just hand trap you and then sit on a big-ass detonator, and it's like, cool, nice gameplay. It's not a terrible matchup, but then also Malice exists, and so... Unchained. Unchained is not great. It's so bad. While a Bawakyu is a very solid addition to the Unchained end board, or to the Unchained options, the problem is, while yes, it is very nice, it's also not great, because in that same set, Meowls was released, which is very bad for that deck, because a lot of your summons are from Grave. And also from deck, which also dies to Fool Loss. And also from hand, which also dies to Perulia. Perulia. You summon a ton, so it, like, doesn't matter. Any of those just kind of hit you really hard, which isn't great. I guess Meowls isn't terrible against the deck now that I'm thinking about it, but it's also not great. So, anyway. Resonator's not worth talking about. Orchist is kind of okay. It's cool, but it doesn't really accomplish anything right now. Sky Striker's fine. Unless you're playing it with the Tenpai stuff, it's not really worth noting, because it's just a worse version of Tenpai, like a significantly worse version of Tenpai, because it doesn't actually OTK, and with the two top decks being the two top decks that they are, it's not great. Vanquish Soul is kind of similar. Its biggest problem is seeing the correct attributes, and if it can see those specific cards, like Raisin, or Mad Love, or something else of that nature, that it's like a starter, maybe you can make it work, but you do really have to see those cards, and that's not consistent. So, Super Heavy Samurai, it's similar to every other combo deck right now, just dying to the Roach. And, like, everything else as well, like Droll and Roach and Nib and etc, etc. Next up we have Mokonko, which is not great. It's just a worse Tenpai again. Then we have the Live Twin stuff. We didn't get the new Live Twin support, so Live Twin isn't really worth talking about for too much. It's just a worse version of Sprite. Now that Sprite actually has the ability to play a more concentrated 2-style deck, the Live Twins aren't really necessary. You could also play, like, Live Twin Fiendsmith, which is an option, but that's also not really all that great of a deck. I wouldn't necessarily put it that highly, but it's a cool little gimmick that you could do. So there's that. Spiral's terrible. So is Raidraptor. So is Argostar. So is, just kidding, Fire King we already talked about. It's fairly decent. Six Sam. Okay. I know everyone loves Six Samurai, right? Everyone here is a fan of Six Samurai. I'm gonna put this as kindly as I can. The new support doesn't do anything for the deck. It'd be cool if it did, but it doesn't. Yes, the cards are good, in Six Samurai, but Six Samurai's problem is still there, and it's that it kind of still dies to everything under the sun. It dies to Ghost Ogre, it dies to Ghost Bell, it dies to, well, that's a lie, but it dies to Droll, it dies to Fuwa, it dies to Perulia, it dies to Meow, well, maybe less Meowls, it dies to Maxi, it dies to Nib, it dies to Imperms at times, it dies to Ash Blossoms at times. There's a lot of hands that just die to an Ash Blossom. There's a bunch of other things as well. Purge and Impulse are not exactly great for the deck. They're not terrible, right? But like, because like, what are you gonna Impulse realistically? But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of cards that the deck can play through, and it's really not good at playing through established boards because it needs so much engine to be able to actually start and finish playing the game. Like, you have to see a set amount of engine just to be able to play the game, and unlike Mermail, where a lot of that engine is disruption or needs to force interaction, Six Samurai doesn't do that. So as much as I would appreciate it if Six Samurai was good, the new support doesn't really solve any of the issues, the outstanding issues that Six Sam had. So while yes, getting 3 Gateway is nice, and like, oh, now you can do like the Gateway combo, if your opponent was able to get the Gateway combo anyway previously, doing it more consistently doesn't really matter too much. Because the thing is, either the Gateway combo resolves and you immediately win the game, or the opponent had the answer anyway and it never mattered. That's kind of it. Either they had the Droll, or they had the Nib, or they had whatever it was, or you end on a basically FTK. That's always been the case. So it's not very good. But yeah, this is going to be my tier list for ranked, for climbing. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys agree? Do you guys disagree? Are your thoughts that actually Ryzeal and Malice are not actually all that good for climbing? Let me know down below. And yeah, that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys did indeed enjoy it. If you did, a like is very much appreciated. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye.